Okay, so I got both of my brushes taped back, and so what I'm going to do is there's a grommet here, and I got a grommet out of my grommet collection, but I'm going to go ahead and insert that back into the hole here. And once I get that in once again, I'm going to take and I'm going to feed these wires through because they have to go through. While I do this, I'm going to take this armature out a second. I put that in there to spread the grease around. We have to put the washers on it before final assembly, which I'll show you in a second. But this is going to go on like that. There's a flat area those wires come down, so you want to get them straight and even. Feed the one on the one side of the grommet and the other on the other side so that they're not twisted in there. If they get twisted, they won't fit past that flat part. So anyway, we're ready for that. We'll put our three washers, the spring washer and the two flat washers on the end there. And the flat side should go down, basically, is the way I like to say it, but the curve up. Anyway, those are on there, all three of them, and I'm going to put that in there. By the way, your bottom of these usually will move a little bit. I mean, they actually have some float to them. There's a nylon with a retaining washer in there. So you can carefully now feed that up and pull things on through there, the wires, until very carefully, and a little bit more wire, and you'll be able to start feeding that on down and line your armature up so it comes on through. And there we go to get it there. We could release the brushes at this point, but I'm not going to for a second. But I'm going to pull these on down. Rotate that a little bit there. Okay, now we're going to take these bolts and we're going to locate the holes. I may have to rotate this to find the holes. See, I'm a little bit off. So I'm going to rotate that on around just a tad until I find that hole. There we go. And you see it comes through that hole there. We'll get the other side in and then we'll put our spacers and such on there. Okay, so remember when I took these out, I said the knurled part goes down, so I'm going to slip that spacer in there and get that on through. We'll take the other side here and do the same on it. Okay, and the next step is there's that little washer that came off, so we want the washer on each side. There's a spring on each side, like such. And we always have to remember to put our little washers back on the shaft. And I always put the curved side, pressure side up. So there we go. And get those on down. And I'm going to put just a tad more grease there and make sure we're greased up on that. And I'm going to grease a little bit in my hole there on both sides. And these in here will float. I mean, they're capable. This presses in and this inside, it actually is self-correcting. It will align with the motor and all of that. So the front one's usually pretty straight. Sometimes on the back one you can actually bend the armature so it's going sideways. So you need to make sure that's fairly straight as you come through there. That all looks good and that is in place where it needs to go. So I'm going to go ahead and take these pieces of tape off, and that will cause the brushes to snap on in. You need to be a little careful because you do put them over this wire, so as you pull the wire off, you need to make sure that you don't rip that copper wire off there. And you need to make sure you don't lose your spring and stuff and spacer as you do that. Okay, I generally put my fingers back on the bolts here where the springs are, because when you push this on, you're going to have to put a little pressure, and you do not want to push the bolts out and lose all those springs and such. So you get your shaft started in there, hopefully like so. You bring it on down, you get those lined up, and now with the springs you're going to pull that all together, but you put your star washer on. And these were painted black, so I left them painted black. That's the way the motor came from the manufacturer. I normally CAD plate most of my parts, and I go to Aero Metals, which is over in Fenton, who happened to be in the St. Louis flood this last week. But anyway, they're back in their building. They didn't get flooded out, they just couldn't get to their building. We'll tighten that down. There's keys on the back of these bolts, so they won't twist on you. They go into a slot, and you just need to tighten it down real good. Now at this point it should turn fairly freely, but you can hear you don't have the tickety tick tick that we had when we started. That's a real good sign, okay? We're going to test it here before we actually put it in the housing, and we'll talk about the recirculating air one, and we'll talk about the fresh air one. This one actually came out of the fresh air one. So I said at the beginning, I'm going to actually put the right colors back on these, and this one actually I'd labeled black, and I'm going to strip these back about a ½ inch. And the reason I'm going to do it a ½ inch is because I'm going to make an in-butt splice and roll that over where it won't make a big bump underneath the sheathing when we, now this is yellow, and I'm actually going to take where I marked the yellow off, so I'm going to go ahead and get a marker and remark that. Okay, I went ahead and stripped my wires and twist them together, but one thing I always do is I make them different lengths, because they will be just a little bit larger as you put some ink shrink on them. So if you make them uneven, then first of all, you won't have any metal to metal possible contact, and secondly is you won't have two big lumps together. So you can dress it out where it doesn't even look like there's a splice in there. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the vise and get ready to solder. Just a tip here while I'm waiting for my gun to get hot. I usually take, and after you solder a while, you get a bunch of black crud built up on the end there. And if you keep it nice and sharp and pointy, the heat comes to an end there, and it's easier to melt it. And just using a file, eventually you wear away your tip. But then again, I use the 6440 rosin core solder, and it'll eat away at the copper or brass, whatever those tips are on those soldering irons anyway. So I clean them up occasionally. I already tested this one to make sure that the soldering gun was hot enough, but basically you put it on there, start getting your wires hot, and then the solder should just melt evenly on there. And I feed solder on there generally fairly liberally, and I make sure it gets flowed underneath. Sometimes you miss that. When you turn it over, if you see copper, you didn't get enough on there. I went ahead, we're going to have bullets on the other end of these, and you'll notice that's why I use this vise with rubber, and it connects real easily, but it doesn't smush the wires, and it holds them real comfortably. But if you put them on the end there of a bullet, let it heat up a little bit, and then that'll feed down in there. People will debate whether the it's better to use a solder connection or a crimp connection. I guess it's okay as long as that you have a proper crimp gun and all of that, but solder connections you can never go wrong on. By the way, I'm pretty good at cutting these, so I cut that to the right length so you just have a little copper sticking out of the end. I intentionally cut this one a little long, but if you do, it's better to strip them a little long rather than strip them several times. You can just nip that off if you cut an excess, and then it's where it needs to be, right on the end. And we'll go ahead and solder that one in now. At least I think I'm going to solder that one in now. You have to wait until the bullet and the wire gets heated up enough. Once you get a little start of the lead solder, you know, it'll pull it on in. It'll suck it on in and it'll help distribute that heat around. But until you get that solder flowing a little bit, you just got to try to heat up the metal and the wire to get it hot enough so you can get a little solder on it. Then it generally goes pretty quick. Okay, I got my soldering done, and I get my heat shrink, which this heat shrink doesn't have a part on it, but I'm using 1/4 inch, and this is 639 for a 4-foot length. It actually has a glue inside, and it's heavy. It's about as heavy as the old plastic sleeves were, so it looks almost identical to the old plastic sleeves they used to use. You can get those plastic sleevings from British Wire, but I choose to use the more modern stuff. I don't know that I'm ever going to be a concourse judged car. I'm more into preserving them for the artwork benefit of it. But anyway, I'm going to slip these on here, then I'll get the heat gun. And by the way, you can see I folded these back, and as I heat shrink them and we put the outside heat shrink on them, you won't even notice them. I bent them back on the smaller wire, and you won't even know there's a splice. Now, you might ask why I went to the trouble to put the cloth-covered wire on here and make it look like it should. 2 reasons. This wire was actually had some water had gotten into it, and it had the greenish copper-looking corrosion on it, about 1 inch back. So I cut enough of that off, and I was afraid it wasn't enough length to go to the connection on the car, so I had to do something anyway. And I do like it to look authentic also, so I put those on there for 2 reasons. Okay, so I got my heat gun, and heat shrink's a pretty simple thing. I usually start the process of shrinking, then I put it, you don't want it over the metal because you'll be using a tool to crimp to push the bullet into the plastic tube that it goes in when you make the connection. But anyway, it's a pretty simple process there of doing the heat shrink. And there you go. Okay, I'm going to slide this next larger piece of heat shrink on, and it's the same kind. It's got a glue on the inside. But I am careful to keep my, getting caught up in there a little bit. You have to kind of be careful to keep them parallel. When I put them through stuff, they got to go through a couple of grommets in the mounts and such. So as you push them in, you want to make sure that they're not all twisted, or it is harder to get them through those holes. Okay, and here is where it gets a little interesting. I always take a little of this liquid tape, and I take it down here where this grommet comes in, and I want it sealed real good, so I'm going to go around there before I do the heat shrink and put a big glob of that on there. You won't see it after you push the heat shrink down. But then you push the heat shrink onto that, and that way when it seals around there, you won't have any leaks at all of the water into your motor. Okay, this is the fresh air blower, and I'm going to put these washers back on there. I had them. They're 0.081 thick, and they're 0.498 in diameter, and you'll see they're quite a bit thicker. Somebody put the standard, I think it's a 3BA washer on there, And this one has a smaller hole and it fits on there quite snug. Where the smaller ones are these ones here that were on there, they'll rattle around on you, but these just perfectly fit on the stud. I've already put my wire through there, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that through the rest of the way. Set my motor in there, and I'm not going to tighten my motor down until I make sure that it is centered. Okay, and then you put one of those big washers, one goes on each side, and this you can try to center, but it won't go in the center of the holes to be centered. But I'm actually going to I'm going to leave one off. I'm going to put two on there, and I'm going to tighten it down, and then I'm going to put the fan blades on and make sure that there's no interference there before I tighten it down truly where it needs to go. And I've kind of judged every one, and they're about maybe a 1/16 inch from the edge on all of them to center, from the outside to inside. So I'm going to try that and see how the fan is centered. As you see, I've put this on, played with it a couple of times, but it is a very tight fit, and the edges are relatively close. And it sets up a little bit right at the end of the shaft, but if you push it down and you're able to rotate it around, you can kind of find the center point on it. And then if you pull it up carefully and tighten the nut down, I think we should have it pretty close to the middle. Now you'll see I gave you that as an example. See how off center that is as I got that centered? So putting them in the center of the hole and tightening them down just doesn't do you any good. Okay, so I went ahead and put that last nut on there and washer, and now I'm going to put this back on the shaft. Now when I said push it all the way down, see it goes farther down than the end of the shaft, but what you want to do is have that just about even with the end. And then you put your brass nut on it. Okay, so when you're done, that should all be even. And I'll go and tighten that in a minute. But you can see now I have no interference. But boy, it's just a fraction from the edge. And when a lot of people say they're making noise, I think on a couple that I've taken out of people's cars or helped them with it, you get a little bit of touching on them and it makes a pretty good noise, a vibration. So, you know, it doesn't take a lot, and we'll test it to make sure it's okay here in a minute. Okay, this is what I call a pusher fan, but we'll give her a try here. There we go. You can see we got air coming out of there. Okay. Sounds pretty good. Runs smooth, no scraping on it. So we're ready to put that one back in the car. And that is what they call the fresh air when it'll go up under the front right fender, if I can get my words out. And I'm going to go ahead and put my other one together, which I have ready here. And to give you an example, some people talk about the recirculating blower making some noise. And on my Cloud 2, it is quite a bit louder. Now, they've added some padding inside the ducts, some felt to quiet things down. The other thing that difference is they put this on a Cloud 3. It is not on the Cloud 2, and it's just some kind of cone. And of course, this is a pusher, so it's coming out. The air's coming out here, so somehow that cone directs the air and quiets it down. Kind of interesting. And when you pull your wire through there, you not only have to pull it through here, you're going to have a grommet on here, and I don't have that handy, but there's just a regular grommet that it comes through. And this one has tapped holes on the side to mount the cone on there, where if you get these confused, this one looks like a place for it, but there are no holes to screw that on. So you kind of got to make sure you get your bodies correct and get them in the right locale. If you would redo this one and put it up in front, that one won't interchange with it for the fresh air. So anyway, we'll get them on the car. One thing I'm going to show you here to kind of put one of these on, and I guess I'm a tool junkie, so you can press them on if you're good with your fingers and stuff, but they make this tool, and I bought this from British Wire. But you want to make sure you're nice and straight and square going in, and you can just squeeze it, and it shoves the bullet on up in there, and you put the other bullet on the other side and compress it. So I find it's easier to do this than mess with them underneath the car. Sometimes as you press them in initially, the little silver piece that's inside the rubber there will slide forward, so it gives you a good pushing surface, and when you push it back, you can move that rubber down back and forth a little bit like that, and make sure that that metal is not sticking out the end. Okay, so I went ahead, and that was the fresh air one. It's the one that gets a recycled air one. It's the one that gets the cone. Dug into my information, and this is a 1/2 inch outside diameter. It looks to be a 1/4 inch inside diameter. And of course, I'm going to stick that back in there. This cone is aluminum, and I sandblasted it. It is not cadmium plated. I'm not going to show this on the video, but I typically spit on the wire and spit in here. It makes it easy to pull it through. I'll spare you that, but I'm going to pull that wire through there. The other thing too is when I took this apart, there were no washers on this, which I find a little bit suspicious, but sometimes that is accurate. I'm going to check the parts book just to make sure before I put it back together. Okay, nothing special about these screws, but anyway, I've got them CAD plated, and I always use quite a large screwdriver, and for some reason American screwdrivers, the end of them isn't quite as thick as what the heads of these are. So in order not to strip them, I always grind them down so they get a little bit thicker head on them. But we'll go ahead and put those in, and then this one will be ready to go back on the car.